Okay, looks like we are recording. And guys, I'm so excited to have on the program my friend Steffen Seitz, who is a lawyer with the Animal Activist Legal Defense Project and someone that I've known since Wayne Hsiung's original Sonoma trial. So we should talk about that. But welcome to the program, Steffen.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I've wanted to have you on the program for a long time because I've said this a lot, and I'm not just trying to like glaze you right at the beginning of the interview, but one of the perks of being in the movement is you get to meet really cool people, and you're one of those people that has been like really interesting to meet and get to know. And maybe we should just start with how we got to meet. But I do want to preview that, with Ridglan in the news and everything. You are the person who wrote the petition for the special prosecutor that eventually succeeded. And so we'll talk about that, but maybe let's go back to how we met, because I'll just take you back to that time that we had this small legal team at the time. You know, Wayne was on trial for organizing mass open rescues in Sonoma County. And I just remember that day, like Wayne was really excited. He kept mentioning this guy Steffen's coming. And there was kind of all this hoopla around you coming. And then when I got to meet you, I was just kind of floored by, your competence, your humility. And also, I just want to bring up, like, there were times when I was having to do things really late at night, and you would come in and help me out with whether it was printing things or stuff. You were doing things that you didn't have to do. And I thought that was really sweet of you and speaks to your character a lot. So, yeah, maybe let's go back to that Sonoma trial and how are you even brought in on that? What was the idea for bringing you in on that trial?
Yeah, so that was my very first weeks as like an actual attorney. I just graduated law school, had passed the bar, and then I was starting, and the Sonoma trial was happening, and we needed sort of all the legal help we could get there because Wayne wasn't allowed to have standby counsel. He was the only defendant left in what was at one point a large multi-defendant case. There's this giant case that's going to go on for weeks and months. And so I flew out there, and it was very much a baptism by fire. So just getting thrown into the deep end. So I felt, the same way that you said that one of the great things about being part of the movement is that you meet interesting people. I feel like that's doubly true for me. Like I have friends who are, at law firms or whatever, and they just hang out all day with sort of these like stodgy professionals who are quite boring. And then I get to be around people like you and Wayne and like people doing like really cool stuff, really impressive stuff, really courageous stuff. And so, yeah, I felt enormously lucky. And I was also learning a lot. It was genuinely trial by fire.
So it sounds like you guys knew each other already prior to you flying out, because like I said, he had kind of like a lot of excitement about you coming. So how did you build up that reputation as someone who is like really on the ball, really competent, if you were just getting started, in your first few weeks like that?
Yeah. So, it's actually, I think, kind of a funny story how I got involved in these open rescue cases in the first place. So I went to law school. Didn't think I was going to be an animal lawyer. I thought animal lawyers did very sort of boring regulatory stuff. And I just didn't think I was cut out for like litigating line speeds or something like that. And I was interested in, I wanted to help animals, but I was like, I'm going to be a public defender. I care about sort of activists and criminal defense, and that's what I'm going to do. And I'll sort of do the animal stuff on the side. It won't be my career. Until I took an animal law class, and I found out there's this extremely narrow niche where you can do criminal defense and also help out animals by representing animal rights activists. And I'd heard of open rescue also because Andrew Sharrow, who's one of the witnesses actually at the Sonoma trial, he's someone I knew from college. I remember him posting about being charged in the Smithfield case, where he'd rescue, he's part of this team that rescued these piglets from this giant factory farm in Utah. And I found that to be like the most beautiful and inspiring activism I'd ever seen. Like, not only did I find it extremely moving, but I just thought it was like a beautiful type of activism where you believe that animals deserve help if they're in distress, and then you just go out and do it, and you dare the prosecutors and the industry to come after you because you did the right thing. And so I just found that fascinating. I was like, I want to write a paper about this. And so I talked to Andrew, and then I got an introduction to Wayne, and like I interviewed Wayne for this paper. And I was thinking, this is just for my law school class. I'm interested in this. I'm gonna write a paper. I'm going to kind of move on because that's what I can do. And then Wayne was like, you should come to this legal meeting we have and just sit in on it. I was like, sure, that's great. That'll be helpful for my paper. It'll be interesting. At the end of the meeting, he said, hey, do you want to write a memo on this thing? I said, sure, I'll write a memo on this thing. This will be interesting. Then he's like, next week we've got another meeting. You should come to that one too. And before you know it, I'm just on this legal team. I never like signed up for it. I just sort of accidentally ended up on it. It was some of the most interesting work I was getting to do in law school. I felt extremely lucky to be on the team. And it was at a time where I think they just really needed lawyers. Wayne had the Smithfield case coming up. Obviously, Ridglan was lurking in the background, Sonoma, all these other cases that had been sort of pending for years. And so I was getting to work on those as a law student. And there's a real need for lawyers in the movement, especially at that time. And so I just was extremely fortunate that after I graduated, I was immediately able to continue working on those cases that I've been working on as a law student.
Yeah, he must have seen something in you, like whether it was like natural curiosity or, maybe you were asking good questions or bringing up good points. Because, when it came to the actual trial and how it went, and of course, Wayne was ultimately convicted, but I think, his hands were tied. We couldn't show a lot of the evidence. You were still very instrumental in being able to provide advice, sort of behind the scenes, especially as our legal team was whittled down. And at one point it was whittled down to just Wayne. Like this was actually after, the jury started to, deliberating their verdicts. But, at that point, like members of the legal team kept getting kicked off, but you were still someone that was there that was able to sort of give him advice, maybe like behind the scenes. And I think he really appreciated having you there because you were actually the only person there for a good majority of the time who had any legal background at all, as obviously I didn't. So, yeah, and that's a very Wayne thing too. I feel like kind of similarly, like it was sort of like, oh, you should come to this thing or that thing, and then slowly you get sucked more in.
It was the exact same thing. Yeah, I mean, you came out there, I think, to do press, and before you know it, you're sitting at counsel table responsible for like 100 exhibits that are constantly changing because the court is just doing these on the fly, kicking one exhibit out, allowing the next. I mean, it was just like such a mess. What the court was allowing, it didn't make legal sense. Like logistically, it was impossible to keep up with. And I mean, I think that's one of the attributes I really admire about Wayne. I think he has an enormous confidence in people and in like the best version of people. And so as someone who's a brand new attorney, like a first week on the job, no one really ordinarily be taking my advice, but I think Wayne trusts people. He listens to people. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
I think it made the legal team also stronger, even though we were sort of a hodgepodge team. If everyone trusted everyone else and everyone was sort of expecting the best from everyone else, it just makes it a much stronger team, despite the fact that we were facing just ridiculous opposition from the judge, from the prosecution, and really long odds.
Yeah, and I'm a lay person, so I can't say this with like an extreme amount of confidence, but it seemed to me like the little nuggets of wisdom that you were able to share were incredibly insightful. And in fact, sometimes you were reading things differently than me, and you would end up being right. Like even for things that may have been like, I remember during jury deliberation, there was something, I don't even remember what the specific was, but I was like, oh, that's probably a good sign. You were like, that's actually a very bad sign. Like I was just totally misreading things. But yeah, it seemed like your insight was very valuable. And I know Wayne appreciated it. Yeah, and like you said, it was just sort of that chaos that is, it's interesting that it was about an open rescue because there's some element of chaos to an open rescue, and then the trial itself is this chaos as well. But it's because you have competent people around you that you feel calm and collected in these moments. And that's how I felt during the trial because I knew I had Murray to lean on. I had the previous person who was going to be Wayne's paralegal was Alicia Centaurio, someone who's been through a trial and been acquitted of open rescue. And then, of course, Wayne himself. But wasn't that just like, even though it ended, badly in the sense that Wayne went to prison, it was just such a interesting experience to live through that. And I think it was like 6 weeks, right? So we were just, it really felt like us against the world in a way, especially with all these negative rulings from the judge. And like you said, like we knew we were right because ultimately it's about the animals. And, maybe a good question that I have for you is someone who's, sort of new to the legal profession. So many people are out there trying to defend, their clients when a lot of times the clients in an animal rights case are actually not necessarily trying to defend themselves as much as defend the animals. And so it's a kind of complicated balance that you have to strike. So I've asked you like 2 questions, just how that experience was like for you. And then also the sort of nuance of being an animal rights attorney. Sorry to hit you with 2 questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think one of the valuable things for me in starting off my legal career at the Sonoma trial, like 6 weeks of this just every day is sort of a new exercise in absurdity. was that it helped clarify very quickly a lot of what happens in courtrooms and a lot of what happens in the legal system isn't actually about the law. It's not enough to be right about the law. You have judges who are influenced by society at large, by politics, by institutional constraints. Certainly the prosecution is that way. And I think it makes very clear, like in law school, you're sort of taught this myth of if you study the cases and you know your legal rules, that can be enough and you can maneuver and so on. But so often it isn't enough. And really what matters is your ability to storytell and to deal with these kind of institutional obstacles that get thrown up. And I think there was no clear example of that in Sonoma. There's multiple times where I was like, I know I'm like a recent attorney, but this is like basic evidence 101 that we're getting wrong here. And it doesn't matter because if the judge makes that ruling, you're sort of bound by it. And obviously it's now up on appeal. And so I think the final, we haven't had the final say in this case by any means. Wayne's appeal, if he still is vindicated in the appeal, I think this whole thing will be a huge win, legally speaking. And I think sort of politically speaking, it already has been a win in a lot of ways. But yeah, so I think that was one sort of valuable experience, is just that I think a lot of lawyers get that wrong. I think maybe even lay people have too much faith in the law itself, when the law is itself a complicated sort of social and political institution. And that's most obvious in these kinds of open rescue cases where the law itself is constantly at issue and everything is so obviously politicized. So I think that's sort of an answer to the first question. And then there's a question of what does it look like to represent people who aren't just trying to get the quickest and easiest resolution, don't just want to not guilty, but actually are really doing this for the animals, who are trying to use their own trials as a platform for the animals who unfortunately cannot themselves be there and tell their own story. I feel enormously lucky. I get to work with people who are courageous, who are doing rescues like yourself and Wayne and the other clients that I've gotten to work with, who are really willing to put their neck on the line for the animals. So that's just an enormously privileged position to be in, to get to work with courageous people like that. But also, I think it's one of the reasons that this clinic was started. Justin Marceau, who's our faculty director, I think he saw that one of the issues is that you have defense attorneys who will be on these cases, but they'll just look at this sort of as like a narrow legal problem, when that's not the way our clients understand this. Our clients understand this as like a political problem, a problem for the animals. It's much bigger than that. And actually having attorneys who are movement aligned, who care not just about a good result in court, but also about what this means in the court of public opinion, what this means for future activists, for organizers more generally. And that's one of the things that I still think I'm trying to, I'm building on, but certainly that's one of the things that we try to bring to every one of our cases. Like, we understand that the courtroom is not the only place that counts, and that what we do legally sort of has implications beyond the courtroom that we want to be cognizant of. And so we're always trying to, I really think of myself as sort of following the activist lead, taking direction from the activists. Like, what are the activists' goals? What are my clients' goals? And if those goals aren't just purely legal goals, I'm trying to think of how the legal strategy can be part of that broader narrative.
Steffen, you've been like this since I've met you, where you're someone who's able to take something that could be very complicated, but you just distill it in a way that's very digestible, and you're very good at explaining things. And I feel like there's a confidence about you. Like you I didn't even realize, I must have known at the time that you were sort of new to the legal profession at the time. But I forgot that in the time since. And that just blows my mind even more, because like I said, you've had this confidence to speak about this stuff very clearly for a long time. Is there anything you can point to, whether it was sort of your law school, maybe your professors or something that sort of prepared you well, or is this just kind of part of the profession? I don't really know what I'm asking, but it just seems unique to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. And I mean, that's extremely generous as an assessment in general. I mean, I think part of it might be from like doing things like the Sonoma case and like having seen the Smithfield trial and other things where you have judges who have been on the bench for 30 years or 20 years or whatever, who are like really respected. And then you see them make rulings where you're just like, that's obviously incorrect. Mm-hmm. And if these sort of respected people are doing these things wrong, then maybe like I actually do know a thing or two. So some of it might be kind of almost like a negative experience of sort of seeing, prosecutors and judges who really should know better getting things wrong. And so that obviously builds a certain kind of confidence that, if I could, I have a sense of how to do this right. I mean, some of it also might be just one of the advantages that I've had because I've been doing this since as a law student and now full time. And there's very few attorneys who get to do that, right? A lot of attorneys, they have some other focus and they get to work on animal cases on occasion. And so one of the benefits we have at our clinic here is that we really get to just breathe this stuff day in and day out. Like I've read every necessity case in California multiple times at this point. We sort of live and, and breathe these things. And so I think that is an enormous advantage that we have. And it's also one of the reasons that if I have some confidence that comes across, it's probably just because I've gotten to do this, even if I've only been a lawyer for like 2.5 years, I've spent those 2.5 years exclusively doing these kinds of cases.
Well, maybe we should talk about this petition for the special prosecutor because, so talking about the Ridglan case, when they dropped charges, there was discussion about, maybe we should file for a special prosecutor. This was about sort of the end of me kind of being away from the situation for a little while, and you guys kind of took over. And at the time when I left, I was like, wow, this is just like a Hail Mary pass. And everybody sort of described it as a Hail Mary pass. You pulled it off. First of all, how did you do that? And how did it, again, it sort of comes back to the team's confidence in you and the clinic, that you were appointed to try this and then that you succeeded. So yeah, how did you pull that off? Because we knew that was kind of a long shot, but you succeeded.
Yeah, and I think the context here obviously is like the criminal case gets dismissed. There's like a ton of people coming to Madison. There's going to be this convergence, all this energy, and suddenly like the flashpoint for organizing is just gone overnight. And so it's like we want something else, some kind of document we can use to like go to the courts or something we can point to as like this is the next step. This is what the authorities should do. And I'm not sure quite who found the special prosecutor provision in Wisconsin law. It might have been Wayne. I know PETA had used it before in the past, so with some mixed results. And then it's basically my job over like a weekend or something to try to put this thing together. And I do want to say like I was very much standing on the shoulders of people that had done incredible work before me. So PETA and some local attorneys in Madison had put together amazing petitions before. They'd had some success, but they'd also been stymied by a system that's ultimately quite conservative. And even when there is clearly a law violation, there's still all this like discretion about whether or not you enforce things. But they'd written great petitions. And so I basically used the petitions that they had and then as sort of a model, as a template of sorts, and was like, okay, now I can think about and plug in all of this animal cruelty evidence. And we also had the advantage of we were ready to go to trial, right? We were about to try the case where Wayne was charged and Paul and Eva. And so we had all this animal cruelty evidence lined up that we wanted to use at trial. And so now we could repurpose it for this petition. And so again, a lot of it was relying on great work that other people had done. And then just trying to get it out as fast as possible, even if it wasn't perfect, so that we had something when people showed up that we could rally behind. And I think the other thing that's worth noting is the initial version of the special prosecutor petition, I think, was solid, but was not, watertight. And it got so much better over those following months. And I think it's one of those things. It's a testament to if you know that you're right and you're confident and you pursue something, sometimes the case will just get a lot stronger. So, for example, Scott Gilbertson, who is potentially our most important witness, who'd been a former employee at Ridglan, I had not had contact with him when I wrote the special prosecutor petition. I had talked to Wayne, who talked to him. And so there's all this kind of like, that's not the kind of thing a court wants to see, that there's like this long chain of like telephone happening. And then Scott, Scotty stepped up basically when he saw the petition, and he testified, and that made it so much stronger. And we had another former employee, Matt Reich, and he also did not, like, I had not been in touch with him. We did not know him when we filed the petition, but then he later on reached out to us because he'd been traumatized by what he'd seen at Ridglan. And so I think partially, if you just name an evil happening in the world and you stand confidently and you get attention for it, good things will happen because people will step up. And so that's a lot of what happened, is that as we built the case, it just got stronger with time.
Yeah, I spoke with Scotty recently for Animal Activism Collective's podcast, and what he had to say was just so damning. And I feel like I had seen some of it before. I asked him some about what the testifying, before Judge Lanford was like. What was it like for you? Were you present for that? And what was that whole situation like? And what do you think it was like? Were there any specific things that you think, and I know maybe because she wrote about them herself, that maybe you can draw from that. But what were you thinking that might be the turning points or the deciding factors for her ruling in your favor?
Yeah, and I was there for that. I was the one actually asking Scotty questions. So he was one of my witnesses. I think Scotty and Matt, the two former employees, were turning points of a sort, because I think it's one thing to be told in inspection reports and sort of these dry clinical terms what's happening. It's another thing when you hear someone say, I saw dogs being held down. I saw their eyelids being cut off. I saw the blood that was spilling onto the floor, and then those dogs just being shoved back into cages. And I'd spent so much time with all of that evidence because we'd prepped this obviously ad nauseum. But I'd always done discrete things. I prepped one witness at a time, looked at these videos at a time. I had never sat down and done the whole thing one after another the way we did for the actual proceeding. And there was times where I was getting emotional, where I was having to sort of keep myself in check, because if you just see these videos one after another, you hear this testimony, I mean, it's overwhelming. And I think that was the impact on the judge. And I think so often, especially in the legal system, we create so much distance from what's happening on the ground. We use these dry clinical terms. The special prosecutor himself never actually went to Ridglan, never saw these things himself. And I think one of the things that we were able to accomplish in that special prosecutor proceeding is we had a full day with a judge where we could just play video after video. We could have employees talk about what they saw. And I think when you have it on that sort of visceral human level, when it's kind of hard to deny, when you see the videos, when you see a dog spinning and spinning and spinning, I mean, it's just so obvious that this is wrong, both legally and morally. And I think that was one of the ways that we could sort of just break through all of that legalese, all of that bureaucracy that gets sort of put in the way of animal activists all the time, and get through to the judge. And, I also, applaud her for being courageous and issuing the ruling that she did. But I think, a lot of it was just that being able to have an opportunity to tell that story without having to couch it in just like these sort of abstract terms, but like really cutting to the chase and showing this is what happens there. These are the people who saw it with their own eyes.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I think maybe it was broadcast, and I did see some of this. Yeah, so this, being a fairly new lawyer, this must have been like one of the biggest moments of your young career, I would imagine. So, what was it like for you? You mentioned that it was, hard at times, like emotionally, like with what Scotty was having to say and Matt and but in the preparation for it, what was it like? I imagine it just probably felt like a lot of pressure in the moment.
Definitely. And I also even when I was like, the evidence is so overwhelming, the scale is so massive, it's so obviously wrong, and the law is very clear here, I still was like, I never gave myself over 50% odds. I was always like, there's no way, the odds were at like 5% when I started. And eventually I was like, yeah, maybe we're at like 40%. I don't know what. I was constantly, because the animals are so invisible in our legal system so often. And so I think if you practice in this area, you're used to losing, or you're used to sort of things not quite going your way. But it's one of those cases where, like, every time we reached out to a vet who wasn't necessarily an animal rights person or vegan or anything else, but if they were just, anytime we reached out to someone who might be an expert or know a thing or two, and we told them about what's happening at Ridglan, it wasn't like they said, yeah, this is bad. No, they were like shocked. People, and anytime people hear about this, I mean, this is the story, like one of the stories of Ridglan is like every time people find out what's going on there, they're just horrified. Even people who have experience with the horrible things that we do to animals on a regular basis, they're like, yeah, this is still next level, that they're like cutting off eyelids, that they're devocalizing. I mean, this is barbaric. And so the more and more I was having those experiences talking with people, the more confident you get, because you and I mean, we know how much sort of animal suffering is in the world, and how little the law does to, how little law enforcement does to actually intervene. And so at some point, it's easy to become desensitized and to think, well, no one's going to do anything. I think that's another thing that Wayne is very good at. Wayne is like, no, the law says this, and law enforcement is just wrong, and I'm not going to get complacent. And I think that's a good reminder, because when you are able to get through to people, as we were able to with Ridglan, people do take action. And the judge, issued a very good ruling and stuff. And so, yeah, no, for me, it was one of those things where, like, I was definitely very nervous. But at the same time, the more conversations I had with people, the more I was able to air out this evidence, the more confident you get. And by the end of the special prosecutor proceeding, I was kind of like, I mean, if this doesn't work, then it'll never work. Like, the evidence is so strong, and it's so overwhelming, and it's just so clear. And and I think the judge saw that. And I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, well, you've described the petition itself as not watertight, but obviously you did a good job because it happened. And I find it even more commendable that you said when you started out that it's like, oh, this might be like a 5% chance. So, like, when you feel like the odds are so stacked against you, and you still like put in the work to do a good job on what you think might go nowhere, that's a struggle for me. Like, because I do a lot of, like, I was doing a lot of like press work. I was volunteering for a while with DXC's press team, and a lot of it was like reaching out to journalists, and sort of knowing in the back of my head they're not gonna respond to me. And so it's a struggle for me to put in a ton of work with those journalists when I know. So I hats off to you for doing a good job.
Mean, look, I totally agree. There was definitely times where I was like, especially because Ridglan fought tooth and nail at every stage, and I was spending all this time on things. I'm like, I could be spending this time on something more fruitful. Like, this is so much work. It's so much time. And it's going to go nowhere. None of this stuff ever goes anywhere. And then obviously it did go somewhere. And so I think for me, at least, that's a good lesson of, like, you never know which 5% shot actually ends up landing. And given the scale of the problem, we just have to be taking those 5% shots because when one does land, it's worth all the other misses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me as like an early lawyer, I feel like that was just a really good lesson.
So like you also mentioned earlier how the special prosecutor that was appointed didn't actually go and visit Ridglan. He actually said that on a like on a radio show very recently in the last like week. I don't know if that was already known, but yeah. And when I talked to Scotty, he also confirmed for me that the special prosecutor did not speak with Scotty. I don't know if you can do this or if it's appropriate for you to do this, but I wonder if as someone who's not a lawyer, I find that egregious. But then someone as a lawyer, is there, can you speak to that a little bit, like about how, how inappropriate that might be if you're looking to prosecute a case? And this is Tim Grinke we're talking about, the special prosecutor from La Crosse County who was appointed thanks to Steffen's good work and Rhonda Lanford's ruling. To look into Ridglan that ultimately ended up with a deal to close Ridglan Farms or for them to give up their breeding license. And maybe can you explain what the ruling was? Not the ruling, the agreement was between Tim and Ridglan Farms in a concise way so that I can stop bumbling it when I say it.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, the special prosecutor Tim Grinke reached an agreement with Ridglan that Ridglan would have to voluntarily relinquish their state breeding license by July 1st of this year, meaning they are no longer able to breed dogs for sale, which has been the bulk of their business model. And there's currently still some 2,000 odd dogs there who are part of that business model. So by July 1st, no more breeding for sale. They also have a smaller research arm. They can continue doing that. That's just federally licensed. They can keep doing this sort of smaller research on dogs at Ridglan after July 1st, but no more breeding starting July 1st. That's a huge win. I mean, this facility's been open since the 60s, just breeding dogs en masse in horrible conditions and then sending them out to just torturous experiments. So the fact that's being shut down, those are thousands of future dogs who are spared those terrible conditions. And in exchange for that, Tim Grinke agreed he would not bring any charges, including felony criminal charges, that he believed that there was good evidence of felony animal cruelty committed by Ridglan as a company, and also some 400 odd administrative violations. So there's also regulators in Wisconsin that ensure that the dogs are don't have open wounds, that their cage sizes are big enough, that kind of thing. And there's some 400 odd violations, which is a really high number in a field that's so unregulated. And so basically Grinke said, I won't bring any administrative violations. I won't bring any criminal charges. And in exchange, you're just going to shut down this entire breeding operation by July 1st. So that's, I think, really good. The bad part, obviously, is it abandons the 2,000 odd dogs who are still there. And Ridglan's allowed to sell them up until July 1st, by which point they would have to surrender them. Or what we're worried about, obviously, is that they would euthanize them. And I think that would probably be a violation of the agreement, potentially of Wisconsin law. But that's obviously our big concern is, like, who knows what happens to those 2,000 dogs? I mean, Ridglan has not exactly been acting above board.
Right. And then what about, him not actually visiting Ridglan Farms and not speaking with Scotty or any other whistleblowers and just looking at sort of like past data? And I should know that there was like a follow-up question that this radio reporter asked him that said, would it have been helpful to go to Ridglan Farms? And he said, I don't know, because I wasn't, litigating what Ridglan Farms is today. I was looking at stuff from the past. I think that sort of summarizes what he said.
Yeah, so I'm disappointed, obviously, in how much Grinke did or rather did not do. I do think that he was acting in good faith. I don't think that he was sort of secretly corrupt or trying to protect the industry. I think he actually was alarmed by what Ridglan was doing. It's why he volunteered to take on the case. But I think he was constrained in some ways, the way that a lot of people are, especially in our legal system, by like an absence of imagination or by sort of accepting artificial boundaries that really don't exist. I think one of the good examples of this is in his report, he said, well, there's multiple instances of dogs having these really big lesions, these wounds between their paws because of improper flooring. But if you have thousands of dogs, the fact that you're going to have a number of these any given year is sort of normal. It's expected. And so I don't think that amounts to a crime. But I think that's a total misunderstanding of how the criminal law works. And obviously also a misunderstanding morally of what this means for the individual dogs. Because the criminal law doesn't say, if you have thousands of animals in your care and you mistreat a small number, that's okay. There's some margin of error for industrial animal ag or something like that. That's not what the criminal law says. It says anytime a dog is mistreated and experiences unnecessary suffering, you've committed a crime. And so for those individual dogs, those dogs have been victimized. Each one of those instances is wrong. And you don't get some sort of like industrial defense just because I do this on an industrial scale. I'm exempt from this stuff. And so I don't think that was necessarily Tim Grenke acting in bad faith. I think it's if you're socialized by a system that takes these things for granted and that doesn't, I think, actually understand that our laws do extend fully here, and sort of just accepts this sort of orthodoxy of, if you do it on an industrial scale, you can get away with it, then it's so easy to overlook these things. So I was very disappointed because I think there was an opportunity here for Tim Grenke to be more aggressive. He could have gone and taken a look at the facility himself. He could have executed search warrants. He was by no means limited by just the evidence that we'd presented him. He could have gathered more evidence. Sure, he's backward looking at crimes that already occurred, but to the degree that dogs are still being kept in those same cages, those are ongoing crimes. And I think he should have investigated those. He should have sought records. He should have gone inside and taken video and photos of those dogs in those cages. He could have tried to subpoena individual employees to get more evidence. I mean, there's any number of things he could have done. And I think instead he sort of took the slightly easier route of just working with what we'd already sort of set up for him, getting this deal, and then kind of saying that's enough.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the feet too, because yeah, I heard him say that in that same radio interview that there were only a few instances of this. But had he spoken with Scotty, and what Scotty told me was that you could not find a dog that didn't have some issue with their feet, and that it was the most widespread problem that he noticed when he was there for 2 months at Ridglan Farms. So it was obviously a much bigger problem than that.
And a lot of that is just him also deferring to these agencies, right? So there's the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, which is the state agency. There's the USDA. They both regulate Ridglan. But these agencies are overworked. Their inspectors, I think, often just are in there very briefly. They have a pretty cushy relationship often with these regulated entities. And so if you just take their word for it, you're going to get such a small picture and a very incomplete and inaccurate picture of what's going on. If the USDA says you have no violations, that doesn't mean you have no violations. It means this USDA, inspector who spent all of 10 minutes in the facility either didn't find something or didn't bother writing it up. Mm-hmm. And so I just think it's an entirely different ballgame. If you were to say, I'm going to go in myself, I'm going to execute a search warrant, I'm going to take a look at what's going on there, I think you're totally right. I think you would see cruelty left and right because that's what's going to happen given just the very design of the facility.
Another inappropriate thing I thought he said, that maybe you can speak to whether this was appropriate or not. I don't know if you can or should speak to that, but I know that there's no love lost between Wayne and Tim Grenke, and that Wayne also has spoken, in strong terms about his disappointment in Tim Grenke as well. But Tim said during that interview that he didn't find Wayne to be credible, which I think was kind of an extraordinary thing to say when he was like sort of the point of contact. And according to Wayne, he stopped responding to his emails pretty quickly in. And obviously, I understand that Wayne's like more passionate about this. But I just wonder, like, to me, that just seemed like you stopped trying, and you also picked a side in a way. I thought that's what Tim Grenke essentially said. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if it's appropriate for you to comment on, but do you think that that was sort of like an inappropriate thing for him to say during that interview, or what?
Yeah, I obviously disagree with that. I think Wayne, and this is sort of goes back to something we said earlier, that Wayne sort of really sees the best in people and expects the best of people, but it also means expecting a lot from people. And so one of the reasons I think that Wayne has been a lot harsher on Tim Grenke than I have maybe is that he expected more, that I'm kind of like, this is about as good as you're going to get from a prosecutor. Whereas I think Wayne said, look, the laws are clear. His job is to enforce those laws, and he didn't live up to that. And so he was very upset with him, which I think is totally fair. And I think it's very disappointing that Grenke sort of took that personally. And instead of sort of seeing this as, Wayne is an advocate, he's going to, phrase these things in quite harsh terms, not necessarily unfair terms, but they're going to be quite clear about what Wayne, sees as going on. And I think it would have been better for Grenke to not say that he doesn't see Wayne as credible. I think Wayne obviously is quite credible. He's been inside the facility, unlike Grenke. And I think some of that is just sort of taking Wayne's criticism, which is a criticism of a public servant, which I think Wayne, he expects a lot from government because government's supposed to serve us. And as a result, I think Grenke sort of took that personally and sort of saw Wayne as not credible, which I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Another thing I want to ask you about is, you mentioned that this 400 some administrative violations is a lot for an industry that's so loosely regulated. in my opinion. And I think just very well documented. What are some of the things that you learned in, doing the special prosecutor petition and going through all this that you think is the most egregious things that are going on at Ridglan Farms, maybe to this day, but certainly documented in the past?
I mean, probably the most egregious thing that I learned about that happened in the past, and there's reason to believe they might not be doing it anymore, but it's kind of unclear, is the cherry eye surgeries, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers and listeners already know about. But basically, Ridglan, beagles will sometimes get these infected eyelids, and then Ridglan, instead of doing what you're supposed to do, which is, typically there's ointments, antibiotics, et cetera, you can apply. Worst case scenario, if it doesn't heal itself via sort of those ordinary medical treatments, you can kind of cut like a little hole and then tuck it in and then stitch it up. That way they keep that important part of their eyelid, because it's sort of one of the things necessary to keep the eyes from drying out, which is a very painful condition for dogs. That obviously requires a lot of individualized care. It requires having vets. It requires monitoring dogs. It requires actually caring for the dogs in your custody. And Ridglan was going to do that because they're a business model that's just trying to make a buck off these dogs. And so what they would instead do is they would take the dogs out of their cages, the ones that had these infected eye glands. They'd hold them down, and without any prep, without any anesthesia, anything else, they would just take scissors and snip off the sensitive, highly vascularized part of the eye, which is extremely painful. There'd be a lot of blood. There'd be no blood control, no aftercare. The dogs would just be shoved back in a cage. Often still bleeding, obviously, from their eye. Other dogs maybe would lick it off of them. Extremely unsanitary, extremely painful. And Ridglan was just doing this routinely to tons and tons of dogs. And every vet I've told this story to is just horrified. And Ridglan's own employees are on record saying, yeah, we were doing this basically until their head vet lost his license, so they weren't able to continue doing it, allegedly. Obviously, we don't know if they're still doing it secretly or not. But that, I think, is one of the most egregious things. But in some ways, what honestly keeps me up at night, perhaps even more, is just the routine cruelty. Like, that's like very extreme cruelty. But then there's the routine cruelty of being a dog in like a 2x4 cage with just wire flooring on your paws. You hear constantly the cacophony of all the other dogs there. Dogs have extremely sensitive noses, especially beagles. Like, I don't think we can even imagine that. And the sort of the smell, the ammonia in the air, the feces that builds up. I just think my understanding is day in, day out for dogs, every one of them is just deeply traumatized, because it's not the kind of environment that any animal, and especially dog, an animal as sensitive as a dog, can be in very long. And so I think all of them to some degree end up traumatized, being driven crazy by these small cages, by this horrible flooring. And for me, that's what sort of keeps me up at night. That's what I find so heartbreaking, is this sort of day in, day out. There's no respite from it. The only time that they ever see the sky is when they're being transferred from the facility to a van to be taken to some place and tortured for some experiment.
Yeah.
That's just heartbreaking.
It is, yeah. And I asked Scotty about this, and he said that when he was someone who was holding the beagles during this cherry eye surgery, and that they were given ear protection, and he just said that the screamings from the dogs, that it was so loud, even in that, and that you mentioned the cacophony of just the sound of the place, like it, and it was constant. And like anybody who has a dog knows that a lot of times the dog hears something way before you do. Like, somebody's coming to the door, the dog's already like ready at the door, and you're like, what's going on? So dogs have, better like hearing, as you mentioned, and also the smells, of course, too. And I mean, the smells in those places can make you retch, and you can only imagine for a dog. It is heartbreaking. It is. So, so when you guys got this sort of like mixed result, I guess you might say, huge win with this closure, but you also had to temper that with knowing that there were 2,000, I guess even at that time, probably more dogs in there at the time, maybe 3. How did you feel about that? And what did you think was like going to be a next step? Did you feel like that was the finish line, or did you think that there was going to be a next thing to try to get the rest of the beagles out?
I mean, we definitely didn't think that was the end of it, because for us, it wasn't going to be over until Ridglan closes down, until all the dogs are out. Mm-hmm. But obviously, again, I think it's important to point out that it still was a massive victory, that there's thousands of dogs who will not be subject to these conditions. But you're obviously totally right that the victory feels incomplete until we get the rest of the dogs out. And so what we did as sort of our next step was we were just game plan, trying to think of any other creative legal tools at our disposal. I know that there was activists on the ground who were pushing legislators, agencies to try to, intervene, revoke Ridglan's license, to try to move more quickly. There's rescue groups that I know have reached out to Ridglan independently and said, hey, look, we'll take the dogs at cost. You don't have to worry about paying for anything else. We'll take them. You can get out from under this right now, and we're willing to work with you on good terms, which honestly Ridglan obviously should do. Like, it's just, they can wash their hands of all of this by just giving the dogs up for adoption. But they refuse to. They're extremely stubborn. And then what we were doing is we were trying to think of like other creative legal mechanisms. And so we partnered with the Non-Human Rights Project, which is most famous for doing what are called habeas petitions on behalf of especially elephants and chimpanzees, basically arguing that like an elephant is a person because they have certain interests in autonomy. And when they're being kept at some of these zoos, it's a violation of that. And so we should use this old common law writ, this old mechanism, this old legal mechanism for freeing them. We partnered with them to do something they had never done before, which is an entirely new version of habeas. And so we submitted a habeas petition on behalf of the dogs at Ridglan, essentially saying, look, there's already, these dogs have a legal interest in being free from cruelty. A judge has already found that that legal interest is being violated because of all these violations of Wisconsin law. And now it's your job as a court to intervene because everyone else has thrown up their hands. The special prosecutor's thrown up his hands. The agencies have thrown up their hands. And these interests are still being violated. So we need you to now intervene and order these dogs to be released. We lost at the trial level because it requires a finding that animals are persons or that dogs are persons. And so that's now before the Wisconsin Court of Appeal. But part of the problem is there's only so much you can do as a lawyer. And so we were limited by kind of these legal mechanisms and stuff. And we're still fighting that out in the Court of Appeal. And then obviously on the side, Wayne has now done this extremely successful rescue. I know there's another one planned for April 19th. We're obviously not involved in that in any way. We'll probably be involved on the back end, potentially representing people if there's charges. But my sense is kind of the movement from every sort of, that's our avenue, sort of the legal avenue that I know there's sort of pressuring legislators. There's Wayne still doing open rescues. It's kind of an all hands on deck moment until July 1st to get out the dogs while we can.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the habeas argument, and this would have been transformative if it got through. So I'm glad that it's not done with, that it's still be before an appeals court. Yeah, and they were pretty famous for almost. I think they just lost. They were working on personhood for an elephant, right? Am I remembering that right? And
yes, they've done a number of these petitions, and I think the one that's most famous is for Happy the Elephant in New York, which reached all the way to the New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in that state. And I think it was 2 justices on the New York Court of Appeals that dissented. So habeas was denied, and 2 of them dissented, saying, we actually think this is a natural extension of the writ of habeas corpus. The story of that writ is that it used to be just, for white men, basically, and then we've been extending it in this sort of logical way to other individuals who clearly deserve the protections of the writ. And elephants are a logical next step. They clearly have these interests. It's wrong what we're doing to them. And so we would recognize them as legal persons and extend the writ. Unfortunately, that was in dissent. But it was one of the first times that any high court has ever recognized that animals can be legal persons. So I still think that's a major milestone. And hopefully the next step is using those kinds of arguments and that kind of, even when it's in dissent, to push a court to finally recognize it for the first time in a majority opinion and actually recognize legal personhood for an animal.
Yeah. So you're saying that there were 2 dissenters on this case, and they were outnumbered, I guess, obviously. What was the final tally? Do you remember?
I'm not actually quite sure how many. I'd have to look up any justices on the New York Court of Appeal. I think it might have been 5-2. I think, I don't know if it's a 7 justice court or not.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Another question, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this or not, because I know you weren't personally involved, but one question that I've had is just how is the case of Ridglan different from Envigo? Since we know that the ultimate result was that Envigo was shut down and all these beagles were taken out and sent to loving homes. And we know that because when we were there in Wisconsin, we met some of those Envigo beagles. It was really sweet. And do you know, what is the difference? I mean, I know we're talking different jurisdictions, different states, but yeah, how is this any different?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, obviously, what's going on at the facilities is not that different. In fact, we've had vets look at both facilities and say what they see at Ridglan is worse than what they saw at Envigo. I think some ways that it's a question of political will, and also obviously slightly different mechanisms. So Envigo was almost entirely federal. It was the DOJ that intervened. It was USDA that had a bunch of violations listed. I think it's just that they had a very good, Envigo had existed for a very long time, doing the same horrible things that they were doing. And then finally, someone cared enough to actually do a proper inspection And finally, an attorney at DOJ cared enough to actually do something about it. So there's all this inertia that was overcome. And I think once they got to a critical mass, then they had legislators, everyone else sign on, and very quickly went from this one sort of inspection that had seen all these horrible things and this PETA undercover investigation to suddenly it's shutting down and the federal government's intervening.
Yeah.
At Ridglan, we pursued it via the state. So we had state level charges. So that's slightly different. Obviously, we were arguing that they were violating state anti-cruelty laws. And the federal government hasn't really been involved at all in Ridglan so far. On the other hand, I think one of the similarities is that Ridglan, similar to Envigo, has been doing the same thing for decades, has been totally flying under the radar. And then suddenly, because there was an undercover investigation by PETA at Envigo, this open rescue that Wayne and others did at Ridglan, that kind of blows the whistle on what's going on there. And then very quickly, you get people organizing, you get a lot of momentum, and hopefully we'll end up having the same result and that, we'll have 2,000 dogs getting out of that facility. But right now, it seems kind of like it's similar in some ways, but we don't have that final end result. And so it's not quite the same, unfortunately.
Right. Did you see that letter that was sent by Pocan to the,
I thought that was one of the funniest. I mean, this case has surprised me again and again. Even at the jail when the rescuers, after the most recent rescue were let out, jail employees were thanking them. Uber drivers, while I was in Madison, were telling me, that they were following this. They were excited about it. It's crazy just how much reach it's gotten and how overwhelmingly positive it's been. And then you have this letter where Ridglan reaches out to their state rep saying, hey, there's another rescue that's going to happen. We're really concerned about this illegal action and we want you to intervene. And basically their House rep says, yeah, go talk to law enforcement about it. But while I have you, I just wanted to know for the record that what you do is alarming and horrible and you should shut down and rehome all the dogs.
Yeah.
So,
I know.
Incredible.
Yeah. And I mean, that's someone in Congress. So I wonder, do you think that's is that just something that will be, maybe you don't know, but I just wonder, that's very entertaining for us to read, but I wonder if it's significant in the sense that, this is a member of Congress. And he does sit on, as he mentioned in his letter, he sits on some sort of House, animal welfare type group, caucus or so. And I wonder if this is becoming a more federal issue. You probably can't speak to this with, inside knowledge, but I'm just wondering if it is starting to get to that point where we do see the federal government get involved.
I hope so. And I certainly think it is significant in that way. And so, for anyone at DOJ that's listening to this podcast, please act and please act quickly. I mean, part of the problem is that we only have till July 1st and every day is a day where Ridglan could be doing horrible things to these dogs. And so, hopefully it is one of those things where momentum is building. And I also think it's telling because people I know had reached out to Mark Pocan even years ago and he didn't do anything. But now there is momentum. Now people have really generated enough attention that he feels like he has to speak out on it. And so I think it goes to show how powerful grassroots activism is. So yeah, definitely it could potentially be significant because it means political winds are changing and maybe federal prosecutors, the USDA, et cetera, is going to step in and hopefully they're sort of seeing what everyone else is seeing. I think that's significant that way. And then I also think it's significant in a sort of secondary way, which is just, it tells you a little bit about where the political winds are going right now, that he felt the need in a letter where he was responding to Ridglan to, release it publicly and say, what you're doing is alarming. Mm-hmm. And I think that should hopefully be meaningful to Ismail Ozan, the DA in Dane County, to the sheriff's office there, to law enforcement on the ground, to federal prosecutors, to the DOJ, to USDA, to everyone else. This is where the political winds are going. This is what people want. This is where the attention is now. And so all of those political actors, I hope, are reading the same tea leaves and going to intervene sooner than later because we don't have a long time.
Yeah. You mentioned maybe AALDP might be involved in the back end in case people get charges in the future for the rescues. I imagine you guys must just have a huge amount of casework. The load must be just incredible. So how do you all deal with that? Because maybe tell me a little bit about the clinic and everything, because I see it as you, Chris, Justin, and I'm sure it goes beyond that. But it just seems like you guys are going to have a ton of work to do.
Yeah, and look, we love having a lot of work to do. We're always happy when activists are getting into good trouble for animals. So if we're busy, that's the sign, I think, of a healthy movement. And there's three of us sort of full-time attorneys. Myself, as you mentioned, also Chris Caraway, who represented Zoe Rosenberg, has worked on so many of these high-profile cases. And then we recently hired a third attorney, Darius Fulmer, who was one of the Shack 7 defendants, has like a lot of history as an animal rights activist. He was a public defender for 4 years. So he's got like an incredible experience of both, criminal defense and also being activist on the front lines himself. And so part of that is because there is a lot of work, and I think that's a really good thing. But I mean, we're also lucky in that each of these cases, we're still able to put more time into it, more work into it, and have more expertise than any of the prosecutors on the other side. Because we're familiar with these defenses, we work closely with these activists, we know the sort of our goals both legally and sort of outside of the courtroom. And so, it's what we learn in one open rescue case often translates in effective ways to other open rescue cases. So we're learning a lot from case to case and hopefully getting better with every case we take as well.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you guys really were about as small as I thought. But that's cool about Darius too, because actually I spoke with Andy Stepanian very recently, and we were talking about the Shack 7. And I was mentioning that Darius is the one that I hear the least about. So it's cool to hear that he's involved in the, AALDP now. That's awesome. Yeah, and you guys have also successfully defended activists who have been facing other charges. It's not just like, the Zoe case. I know that you guys defended someone I know and very recently and successfully defended them. And I guess another question is, the challenge, I guess, that you guys have when you're really trying something hard, which is to defend people who are doing open rescues and that sort of thing. And so you may get these losses, but we know, like the activists know, that you guys are incredible attorneys, incredibly competent. How challenging is it to convince people of that when you get losses,
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I appreciate that, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I think partially people understand that open rescue cases can be tough. If you had told me that you'd ever be able to get an acquittal where someone films themselves walking into a factory farm and walking out with animals and posts it publicly, it's a miracle, honestly, that prosecutors lose those cases. But on the other hand, we do have good arguments, and we do have good experience, and juries are on our side when we're able to tell the story. And so often the difficulty is, can we even tell the story? Like, how much are we able to get out there in front of the jury? And so that always depends on the judge. It depends on the particular story we're trying to tell, the particular charges, et cetera. But that's definitely part of it in terms of being able to convince people that we're competent in these cases. I think hopefully what we're doing at these trials, then ultimately on appeal, kind of speaks for itself. But also, I think one thing that you sort of also were kind of getting at is we have a bunch of other cases. So obviously we have a relatively small number of these open rescue cases, and they take a lot of time, a lot of attention. They're very high profile. But we also have a lot of sort of run-of-the-mill protest cases. There's been an incredible upswell, I think, of grassroots energy around anti-foie gras, anti-fur, cage-free campaigns where people are getting sometimes charged with stupid stuff like trespass or disorderly conduct for just chanting outside of a restaurant or a Marriott or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. And so we've worked on a bunch of those cases. And so we have like a pretty steady docket of those kind of run-of-the-mill protest cases. No one's trying to get arrested. And our goal really is to get that resolved as quickly and painlessly as possible for those activists so they can get back out on the street and keep doing the important work they're doing. So sometimes activists just want to get back out there. It's something minor. And sometimes it's like these open rescue cases where the trial really is part of the activism, where they're trying to use it as a public platform. And we obviously do both of those things.
Yeah, it's tough. This may be an inappropriate question, so stop me if it, but I'm just, a lot of the times I'm thinking like, what I saw in the Sonoma trial was like, we were prevented from showing this evidence or that evidence or talking about this or that. And I'm thinking like, as a lay person, I'm like, what's going to stop them from like, I'm just saying, if I was on that stand, I might just say something that the jury's going to hear, and it can't be unsaid. So what then? Maybe that's some practical advice, but I just like when they say you can't talk about this or you can't talk about this animal cruelty, what is stopping someone on the stand from actually doing that? Would that just be just a bad look, that it looks like you're defying the court or something? Or is that like really consequential? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, to the degree that you're like willfully disobeying the court's orders, there's all sorts of sanctions that could happen, up to, including even like contempt and stuff, whether that's for witness or for the lawyer. So that's obviously one of the concerns. It's also like, I mean, another thing that can happen if you do say something you're not supposed to say, and it seems quite willful, is a mistrial. So basically the whole trial's over, we're starting over again. That's often not great either. But then I would say, another thing is, one of the takeaways is that even when we've had judges who are really biased and I think quite horrible, afterwards, when we talk to the jurors, one of the consistent themes that every juror says is always that they trust the judge. Even bad judges, they trust. And it's because I think if you're a juror, you're not used to being in court. There's one person who instructs you and talks to you, wears the robe, seems authoritative, and you just naturally trust them. You're sort of taught by the system to trust them. You have all the reason in the world to trust them. They're the only person who ostensibly is not trying to convince you or persuade you of a particular outcome. And so that's who you trust. And so to the degree that you're trying to say things that violate the court's orders, you're going to get objected to pretty quick. The court's going to intervene. The court's going to issue some kind of admonishment. And then, if you keep doing it or you do it particularly egregiously, the court might get quite angry with you. And that actually, I think, is quite a bad look. Because we don't want to look in court like we're rule breakers, that we're kind of like making things up as we go along. And that's partially because I think the ethos of open rescue isn't actually rule breaking. It isn't actually law breaking. The ethos of open rescue is what we did is right morally and legally. And if we can tell you that story, you'll agree with us because we actually have the law on our side and we have morality on our side. And I agree with you, often it's hard to tell that story because of judges, disallowing various evidence and so on. But I think it's one of those things where you have to balance, trying to get in as much as you can without at the same time like overtly disobeying a court's orders, which I think is both harmful legally and also just like perceptually to the jury.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I remember from the Sonoma trial that you were saying, that Wayne was saying a lot, was just how much trust that the jury probably has in the judge. And just how that's a very common theme. And as a layperson, as somebody who's like not been involved in that kind of stuff, that was kind of surprising to hear. Just because I always thought like, people have this sort of like sense of that I don't know. I just thought there were more rebels out there like that question authority. But I guess you're right. Like it is sort of an overwhelming setting to be in, right? I mean, you're getting instructed, you're sort of taken out of your life. I'm talking about a jury right now. So you're taken out, away from your job, but you also probably just want to get out of there so you can get back to your family or whatever. But it probably is an overwhelming situation.
Plus, if you're like overtly rebellious or whatever, you're probably going to get struck, right? The prosecution is not going to want you on the case. And the same way that if you are like, if you work for industry, we would strike you. So I think that's one thing, is that the jury ends up often being kind of like this like median kind of selection of citizens. It's also the case that we're very rarely going to trial in, Berkeley, California. We're going to trial in what are often sort of agricultural heavy counties. So that's also obviously going to have a certain selection effect of who might end up on a jury.
Yeah. I remember there was this moment in the trial when someone had mentioned it would be nice if the jury could see the rest of this video that had been cut. And the court just shut down.
Yeah.
And everybody was cleared out and everything. That particular witness was almost struck, but they were allowed to stay. But yeah. So so that's interesting. So
I will say, if I could just interrupt.
Yeah.
I do think it's obviously really tough to often tell our story because of the judge disallowing evidence. But sometimes when we do it well and we're able to get in some amount of the story and some of it's kept out artificially and the jury ends up on our side. And I think that in Sonoma, we kind of struggle to fully get there. But when that happens, then evidence being hid from the jury can be helpful. So I know when we were talking to some of the jurors in the Smithfield case, there's one instance where they wanted to show a picture of one of the piglets who was rescued. The quote unquote stolen property. So like as probative of evidence as there could possibly be. And the prosecution objected because in the background you saw the piglet's mother's sort of like the mother pig had these bloody teats. And it's just like a horrible background. And so the prosecution actually insisted we can't show this image. And so what the court did is took scissors and just cut around the piglet. And multiple jurors that we talked to afterwards said that said something to them. They realized that they were not getting a full picture, quite literally, because they were just getting this cutout image and there's all this stuff being kept from them. And once they were on your side, once they began to see there's something horrible going on here and they're hiding it from us, that can actually be helpful for us because it becomes quite clear, look, it's the government that isn't being honest with you. We want to give you the full story. The government isn't trying to give you the full story. They're trying to hide things. But obviously you have to get to a certain threshold where the jury already kind of trusts you and believes that what you're doing is morally right, for them to begin seeing it in that kind of light.
Gotcha. So was it the Smithfield trial that was sort of your entryway and not the Sonoma trial?
So I was a law student during the Smithfield trial, but I was working on it sort of remotely. Like I was, sending memos and stuff. Actually, the very first memo I ever wrote when Wayne invited me to that meeting and asked me to write a memo on something was about the applicability of the necessity defense to the Ridglan open rescue. So actually, like Ridglan is kind of like a full circle story for me because that was the very first thing I ever worked on. But then, I was doing a bunch of stuff on Smithfield and kind of whatever was, there was the North Carolina trial that Wayne also had. So I was working on that one a little bit. But it was a lot of just like writing memos on like various legal issues that came up.
Interesting. It was the North Carolina trial when I met Wayne and DXE to begin with.
And then Sonoma was my first time actually like being there in person as an attorney, getting to actually sort of help out in a more concrete way.
Gotcha. So yeah, he knew you pretty well from the Smithfield experience then on also. Yeah, that is interesting that Ridglan was sort of your entry point as well. And yeah, now you have this kind of full circle moment. Well, that's pretty cool. And it was sort of since, so you were working with AALDP, but you got hired on after Sonoma, right? So then you became like full-time with AALDP.
So even while I was at Sonoma, I was employed by AALDP. So I started with the project here right after law school. And basically the first thing was like, just fly out to Sonoma and be helpful however you can be helpful because, the court is allowing so little legal help that even a brand new attorney like yourself will hopefully have an impact.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of interested in your background. Getting to know you has been really cool, but we haven't really talked about like our childhoods and that kind of stuff and how you got into animal rights and I guess it sounds to me like you started to go into law before you started thinking about maybe applying this to animals. So how did this all sort of come about for you?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have like the most exciting story. I feel like oftentimes people have a story of like connecting with a particular animal, and that wasn't really my experience. I didn't really have like pets growing up. I lived in like the suburbs of Houston. I went to Catholic school. It was not like exactly a particularly sort of radical upbringing, but I was always very interested in ideas. I was very, very religious as a young person. And so I thought deeply about, because I was so religious, I was thinking a lot about sort of the meaning of life and that kind of, when I got to college, that was one of the things I cared about a lot was thinking about philosophy and sort of acting ethically and sort of how to live a meaningful life. And so I studied philosophy in undergrad and I went to Princeton where Peter Singer was one of the philosophy professors who is, famously the author of Animal Liberation, taught this practical ethics class that talked a lot about our treatment of animals. And here's the crazy thing is I didn't take that class. I just took like ancient philosophy classes. I was like not interested in any of this like new modern stuff. I didn't want to take that. But what was great about it was even though at the time I was still eating animals, I was by no means sort of like an animal person. I cared a lot about ideas and I cared about acting ethically. And so I spent a lot of time just like getting into debates and conversations and discussions with people who were in those classes, who did care about this stuff because there was sort of this emerging program at Princeton. And the more I had those conversations, the clearer it became to me that like I was wrong in those conversations because I was obviously there's a lot of cognitive dissonance for myself and I was asking these questions. And at some point it became clear that there's no way that I could justify continuing to eat animals. Just as a sort of philosophical matter, that if I believed that animals felt pain, it wasn't necessary for me to inflict that pain on them by eating them. And it'd be so easy to stop. That was just obviously the right thing to do. And so basically, as soon as I graduated and I had to start buying my own groceries, I just stopped buying animal products, went vegetarian first. But even then, I thought I was going to go to law school eventually, become a public defender. I cared about criminal law stuff, about mass incarceration. I cared about animals, but my understanding of an animal lawyer was, again, a very narrow thing, very sort of regulatory, statutory, like Endangered Species Act kind of stuff. And like, you build a long record and you spend all the time working with agencies. And I was like, that's not sustainable for me. It's important. I'm glad people are doing it. But I'm much more moved by like public defense, by getting to represent people, by standing up against the system and against, especially the carceral system, which I still think, is horrible the way that we try to sort of solve social problems by putting people in cages.
Right.
But it was during law school that I discovered this sort of narrow intersection, partially by taking an animal law class where I read Justin Marceau's book, who sort of talks about the intersection of animal law and animals and the carceral system. And then partially just by learning about open rescue and about what these like extremely courageous, really cool activism that was happening around the country. And then got involved that way. So it was very much accidental. But as soon as I discovered it, I figured out, I don't have to decide between criminal defense and standing up against the carceral system and animals on the one hand. I can actually do both by representing activists against the carceral system and trying to use that actually to tell a story. I think one of the great privileges of my job is ordinarily when you're like a public defender or you're a criminal defense attorney, you just kind of take the law as given. Obviously, the law is political, but you sort of have to take it as given. You're not going to be able to argue to the jury that a particular statute is like a bad statute or whatever. You just have to defend them as you can. But we get to actually politicize things. We get to point out to juries and to the public at large that the law is totally upside down, that who should be on trial is Purdue, it's Ridglan, it's these giant animal abusing corporations. But who's actually on trial, who the state actually protects, are these, or who the state actually comes after, are these rescuers who are acting heroically and morally. That's just totally upside down. And so I think one of the cool things that we get to do is kind of dramatize the upside down legal system that we have.
Yeah. Well, I love that you said before you even told me that story, you're like, this is going to be very uninteresting. And then maybe I'm just a big dork because I thought that was super interesting. So first of all, so you said you went to Princeton. You didn't take Peter Singer's class. But I guess the culture there is just that all the philosophy students are engaging in debates. And so
that's more generous maybe than what's actually happening. I mean, some of this is probably that I'm like a nerd who also cares a lot about like these kinds of like ethical discussions and stuff. And I was probably annoying lots of people by having these conversations all the time. But yeah, there's enough people who care about, who are going through sort of the same kind of angsty phase in life as I was, who care a lot about trying to live a good life, a meaningful life, and doing sort of good things. And so we were having a lot of those kinds of discussions, and I was part of sort of the broader social justice scene in college, which obviously had like a higher proportion of vegans and people who cared about animal rights. And so you're just having those kinds of conversations. And the more I had the conversations, the clearer it became to me, like philosophy has made very little progress since Plato, but to the degree that there's emerging consensuses on these sort of big questions, one of the emerging consensuses actually is that what we do to animals is totally unjustifiable.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty incredible. I bet you Peter Singer would be pretty fascinated to hear that his course, has like, expanded outward just through his students talking about it and that sort of thing. It's pretty cool. And then, so you said, so that was undergrad for you. You were at Princeton, and then you took, where did you go to college for law school and took Justin's class, I guess it is?
Yes, then I went to Yale Law School, and I took 3 years off between that. So I spent 2 years between that setting up educational programs in prisons. So I was still doing like prison work. That was in Massachusetts. I was setting up like tutoring and college programs and stuff in prisons around the state. Then I took like one gap year. Then I went to Yale Law School for 3 years.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah. These are just impressive institutions to begin with. We're talking Ivy League schools. So, I can see where even just the name of the institution alone just lends a lot of weight, a lot of credibility, and probably a lot of confidence to, not to make it, elitist or anything. I don't mean it that way, but, you've been around some incredibly bright people. I grew up near Duke University, and, I always said, like, there's like a mixture of people at Duke. It's like people who are incredibly privileged, and then there's also this other people who are just incredibly brilliant, and you have a mix of that, so that's my sort of Ivy League experience, and Duke's sort of like a secondary Ivy League school. So yeah, you're surrounded by these people who are incredibly brilliant all the time. And so that's, like you said, that's just going to strengthen your debating, your thinking and that sort of thing. And it sounds to me like when you were at Princeton that you were using your college experience in a very productive way. At least in those times when you were talking to those people and having these philosophical discussions. That must have been like a really cool time in your life, I'm guessing. Just sounds like it was a lot of deep thinking, a lot of like really interesting stuff going on for you as a young person.
Yeah, no, I felt really lucky because I ultimately sort of want to go into academia. I do really enjoy like thinking deeply and reading and writing and having sort of discussions with people. And so it was like a time where I got to indulge in a lot of that. And one of the things that I actually remember, and this is relevant, I think, to the animal sort of turn for myself as well, was I got to teach a philosophy class in prison. So I was doing some prison teaching stuff while I was in college. And it was really cool because so often in like college classes, not everyone's done the reading. You're trying to get by, you're trying to get a decent grade. It was like a totally different experience in prison when we were working with these incarcerated students, because I think they were so desperate for like knowledge and for this experience and for getting to have these kinds of conversations. It was like the only time I've been in a classroom where they're like begging me for more reading afterwards, being like, you mentioned this other thing, could you print that out and bring that to us? Because obviously like they don't have that, so they don't have, the internet inside. And so we like print out all these stuff and bring it to them. And we had these great discussions. And one of the classes we taught was called like a big questions class. And so each week we did like a new sort of moral issue, like abortion or euthanasia or whatever it might be, punishment, et cetera. And one of the classes was on animals, because one of the four of us who was teaching the class, and it wasn't myself, but one of the four of us, she was vegan. She cared a lot about climate change, cared about animals. And so we decided to have that class. And it became so clear to me during that class that like there's only one, like all of the other issues, there's arguments you can make on both sides. I tend to maybe think that one side is stronger than the other, but like at least there's a colorable argument on the other side. The animals, there's basically nothing on the other side. Like it's very clear that there's only like one correct answer here. And so having to be the teacher in that context and sort of try to facilitate discussion makes it also very painfully obvious how one-sided that issue is. So I felt very lucky in that respect. And then one other point I'd like to make on just sort of like the Ivy League point and so on. I actually think in some ways that can often be a trap. I certainly have experienced that myself, and I see that a lot in some of my friends and peers, is that like you spend so much of your life kind of chasing gold stars, trying to do things right, get good grades, et cetera. And so you just go from like one sort of prestigious thing to the next, or sort of one sort of socially recognized thing to the next, from one good school to the next good school. And you try to go to like a big law firm job that's very highly paid and fancy, or to some like federal job as a prosecutor or whatever that's like very fancy. And you become very risk averse because you feel like you have a lot to lose. And I certainly often feel that way myself. But I think one of the reasons I feel very lucky to be part of the animal rights movement and get to work with really cool people is that it helps change a little bit of that frame of reference, where like the real advantage of going to like a good school and having fancy credentials is it should be freeing. It shouldn't be the case that you feel like you're going to just try to go from one fancy thing to the next. It's really like now you can go and do something good, because even though it's not necessarily earned or justified, you get a certain amount of credibility and people trust you in a certain amount. You get to be in certain rooms that otherwise you wouldn't be in. And like that's an enormous privilege, and it's really great if you get to use that for something good. And so I feel very lucky that I get to be around people that remind me that I have that kind of advantage and privilege, and I get to use it. And so I really appreciate that.
I mean, I just thought that that's already just like having the label of Princeton and Yale next to your name is just very credibility building, and I speculated, I wonder, how that can be used and, utilized by the animal rights movement. I know, I think that one of the reasons why Wayne and I became close is because Wayne saw that I was former NPR, and I think that he's always seen that the NPR label is powerful in and of itself, and that can be utilized. And I think we even overstate that to some extent. I worked at public radio stations across the Southeast and all that, but I was part of the NPR network. But it does get me in the room with people. I have been able to use this label to get in the room with people that, maybe I wouldn't have otherwise, that sort of thing. And, it kind of takes me back to college, because that was just an internship that I got with a public radio station. It ended up opening the door for me in so many ways. Like I was very lucky to get that. And I feel like I've been able to use it in a way, that's been powerful. So similarly with you, I think the same thing, that using these sort of labels to strengthen our movement is really helpful. It's very helpful to say, someone's been educated at Harvard or Yale, anytime we have like a legal opinion of somebody's, from Harvard or something, that just sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds good.
I mean, and that's one of the things. I mean, it's unfortunate that should have no extra weight. It's either the argument is good or the argument is bad. But look, I mean, it definitely affects like judges. When the judge sees that it's, some professor at Harvard wrote this thing, it does make a difference. It's unfortunate, but if that's the world we live in, obviously we should use that for the animals.
Yeah, for sure. And so then you said like it was like after Princeton that you started to think about like eating animals, and possibly you went vegan, and I guess when was the time when you decided that, I'm vegan now?
That was in law school, actually. So I went vegetarian initially, and then I was definitely vegetarian longer than I should have been. Like I think I knew what was happening in the dairy industry, and it was just in some ways like I just had to make that sort of final change. But some of that honestly was, I think the difference was that I saw myself as someone who was primarily focused on mass incarceration and on anti-carceral work. And like that was sort of my identity, especially with respect to kind of like social justice movements. And it was in law school that I began engaging much more with the animal stuff. I was part of the animal group at Yale. I was like a fellow for this sort of animal program there. And I think it just goes to show how important community is, because that's when that final sort of switch flicked. And I was kind of like, at this point, I have no excuse. I should just go vegan. It's not, I'm basically vegan already in a lot of ways. Let me just go ahead and do that. And then, yeah, then it sort of becomes a more important part of your identity. And then it sort of mobilizes you to do more things in the future. So, yeah, I mean, part of it honestly was just the way that I viewed myself, that over the course of law school, I began to see myself not just exclusively as focused on anti-carceral work, but more broadly as opposed to cages in all their forms, whether they're for human beings or for animals.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting juxtaposition, like for Wayne and Zoe and people like that. You've got these prosecutors that are trying to put them in a cage for taking beings out of a cage. Like, it's just such an interesting juxtaposition. Like, they're trying to put people in cages, they're trying to take people out of cages.
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
It's just, I think it's one of those clear demonstrations, like what our movement is for. Our movement is against cages. It's against sort of punishment for its own sake. It's against cruelty, and it's fundamentally about like compassion and kindness. And like that's never clearer than when the state is trying to put someone in a cage when all they did was help an animal who was going to die. Like, I mean, it's insane. When you actually like boil down what happens in these open rescue criminal cases, it's insane. It's mind-boggling that anyone would spend their time prosecuting someone for just trying to help an animal who's in distress.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. I mean, that's, I think, the best distillation of what our movement's about.
Yeah. The other time that you and I spent a good amount of time together was at an animal sanctuary. And I thought that was just such a blissful time, wasn't it? And
it was beautiful.
Yeah, it was just amazing. And yeah, I thought, you in particular, I thought you took to that sanctuary work pretty well. Like, you were very hands-on. You were, I think that's your second calling. If you,
I mean, it was just, it was so nice. It was like beautiful just to be outside, be with the animals. Like I would be happy to shovel shit every day at a sanctuary. It's just like, it's like a beautiful thing to do, to be outside, could do a little like physical exercise. And at the same time, you're with these, like, I had also never been around a cow the size of Buddha, like this giant, he was he was rescued as like a dairy calf, I think, basically, right? I think is the story.
Right.
And I mean, he was huge and so gentle and beautiful. So yeah, there's just like so many moments like that at that sanctuary as well, where it's like, this is so gorgeous. I love this.
Yeah. So that was at Happy Hen Sanctuary. That's Zoe's sanctuary. And Buddha just passed, unfortunately, I heard about a year ago. Yeah. But Buddha was such a beautiful cow, like just giant. I mean, like almost like an elephant-sized cow. So
which also just goes to show, like, and even as someone who's like in this movement, who like thinks about farmed animals a lot, like you just never see a dairy cow, especially male dairy cow, get that old. And get to that size.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. You often don't see the pigs get that size either. And you can see some just like massive pigs at that place. And seeing animals who are just like happy and in this very just gorgeous setting too. But yeah, that was a nice time. That was really good. So you were saying, like, what was that like? One of your first times around farm animals at that point, or no?
I think so. It's one of my first times around some farmed animals, I would say. Certainly around pigs. I hadn't. I mean, I'd been around some chickens and cows before. Mm-hmm. But I mean, also it's different when you're like, I don't know. So it was also nice because we had a lot of unstructured time. It wasn't like it was like a tour of an animal sanctuary or like just a volunteer work day. It was like we spent a lot of time where we got to just kind of hang out with them, maybe do some work around them, but just kind of be there with them and sort of see what it's like day in, day out in this like extremely idyllic setting.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Like, where do you think that your work is going to go from here? Like, what I guess maybe what I should ask is like what you're most excited about, because you've taken part in such monumental things already. And I think the efforts that you guys just put in with, the habeas writ, I think is also just something that we shouldn't downplay. It's an amazingly, like I said, it could be amazingly transformative, and it's ongoing. So this could be a game changer right there. Yeah. So what are the things that, like, I guess, occupy your time right now, and what are the things that excites you the most?
I mean, what excites me the most is that the movement does feel like it's getting stronger. It's as strong as it's ever been. It's more unified, probably, than it's ever been. It's very dynamic. All the stuff happening in Ridglan, the amount of attention it's getting, the amount of sort of enthusiasm, and hopefully we can sort of keep building on that and channeling that from one sort of target to the next and one sort of animal to the next. So that I find really exciting. And from like a legal perspective, I think that's I think we're already right on the law when it comes to like the necessity defense. I think we're right on the law when it comes to personhood for animals. The problem is that judges aren't quite there with us, and you saw this with other movements in the past, right? Like you lost, for example, when people were pursuing gay marriage, they lost multiple times before they won. And when they won, it wasn't because the arguments were different. It wasn't because the laws were different. It was because the social and political context had changed. And so, as a lawyer who gets to work on some of these arguments, I'm very excited that we're building such a strong movement right now that hopefully that social and political context is beginning to change. And so I'm just excited I get to keep working on some of these cases.
Yeah.
The most immediate thing that I've been spending some time on, I'm very excited about, is Wayne's oral argument in his appeals on April 23rd. That Justin Marceau, our faculty director, will be arguing that case. And so I've just been doing a lot of that prep work. I've been going through a lot of those Sonoma transcripts, trying to figure out all the exhibits and figure out exactly what are the most important things for Justin to hit on, and sort of here's how I would recommend dealing with some of these things. And so that's one of the things I'm definitely excited about, is some of these appeals that we've got queued up.
So that's the appeal for the Sonoma case right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like, I almost feel like, you brought up gay marriage, and I feel like that happened way faster than a lot of my friends expected. Like, I remember people cautioning me, like, when it was like Obama's term, they were saying, Obama better not press too fast. And then gay marriage was legal by the time he left office, I believe. And it wasn't him, it was the Supreme Court ruling. But yeah, I just wonder, like, I almost feel like maybe we're on the cusp. I wonder if you feel the same. And then I wonder, what would happen? Like, here's probably too big a question, but I wonder if the courts move way faster than the public. Like, for instance, there's suddenly like personhood for animals. What's that huge backlash that we may see, from the public who still wants to eat their bacon or whatever? I wonder what would happen if the courts moved right now. But do you think that, like, we're right there on the edge of it?
I don't know. I mean, I think my sense is that if you were to have pulled the marriage equality movement just a few years before Obergefell, they would have probably also had like some being like, we're right on the cusp, and some be like, no, we got to slow down. It's still going to take a lot of time and organizing. And from one of the things I've just read in like the social movement literature is it's like there's like a tipping point that happens where it feels like it's still distant, and then suddenly it feels inevitable, and it happens almost overnight. And it's really hard to know exactly when that moment comes. But a lot of it is sort of building that infrastructure, building public support so that you can harness it when that moment arrives. And so that's kind of where I see my role. I'm not sure I have a sense of if we're on the cusp or if it's still a ways away. I think we could be, though. And I will continue to work and act as if we're getting close to that cusp, because it's worth putting our energy and sort of being ready for that moment when that moment finally arrives. But yeah, that's sort of my sense, is that it's not gradual. It's not like, if you were to chart it, it's not like a linear sort of progression. It's very much like going almost nowhere, and then suddenly it shoots up. And so we don't know where we are on that graph, but I think we got to organize as if we're close to that moment so that we're ready for that moment when it arrives. And I think, yeah, there's definitely reasons to be super optimistic. So that's kind of where I see myself, as kind of agnostic on that question, but continuing to do work however I can to get to that moment.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, Steffen, it's been nice talking to you. I always ask my guests when they come on my program, like, if there's like books that they recommend, that sort of stuff. And also just like where people can find out more about your work, and yeah, just like kind of learn more. And then also, like, beyond that, always ask multiple part questions, but just like, if there's stuff that you enjoy, like outside of the movement and stuff like that, you recommend books, films, anything like that you think people should check out.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like books, probably people have read a lot of the ones that I would recommend, whether it's like Animal Liberation or sort of your kind of core animal texts. One book that I really enjoyed as someone who thinks about social movements a lot is This Is an Uprising, which is, it's not an animal book. It's a book about social movements and about how to harness the power of social movements. And so that's a book I think is excellent for anyone that's interested in movements as a whole. And obviously we have a lot to learn from the movements that have succeeded, that have come before us. Right. So that's definitely a book that I would recommend. In terms of my own work, like, I mean, ultimately, sort of what I work on a lot is the intersection of when I'm not doing sort of this sort of litigation, I also do some scholarship where I think a lot about criminal law and social movements and how the two intersect in the way that criminal law at times can be used by social movements, but also in the ways that criminal law can shut down social movements. And so like one of the pieces is this voluntary prosecution piece that I wrote with Justin and Wayne, which basically argues that historically social movements have used criminal trials, like deliberately set themselves up to be prosecuted so they could use a platform of a criminal trial to tell a compelling story. So we see with Open Rescue is what we saw with Susan B. Anthony when she was prosecuted for voting, quote unquote, illegally at the time. And so it's a sort of a recurring tactic that we talk about. But then I've also written about the ways that criminal law can be used to go after social movements in really bad ways. So I've had like a piece that was recently published in the Michigan Law Review called Conspiracy and Social Movements. And these pieces are like a little bit dense. They're like for like a legal audience. But I still think there's like value in them, hopefully for a general audience. And the value really is about the ways that we can think about using criminal law, but also being cognizant of the ways that criminal law can be used against us and how we have to be careful and how we have to also be pushing for better laws. So that's certainly one of the things that I'm interested in. That's one of the things I'll sort of be pursuing long term. My goal is eventually to go into academia and to kind of continue sort of building the next generation of animal lawyers. And then the last sort of question of like outside of this, what I enjoy doing. I mean, it's a pretty sort of stereotypical Colorado answer, perhaps, but I love being outside. I spend my summers hiking and my winters skiing if I can. I really enjoy going to the mountains here. We're very lucky for where we are here. And also just like it's like a great way to kind of detox from the kind of stuff that we see day in, day out in this line of work when you get to be outside in nature. So I really enjoy that. And I also still enjoy having these like long discussions like the ones that I got to have with you in Sonoma, conversations like this one here. There's very little that I enjoy more than just like a good, like honest intellectual discussion with someone. I feel like that's where I do most of my learning.
Well, I'm glad you like hiking. So if I'm ever out there in Colorado, then we should go for a hike. Yeah. All right. Well, Steffen, I'll make sure that we link to all those papers below. But like I said at the beginning, it's such a thrill to know you. I feel very lucky to know you, and I feel like if I were getting in good trouble, as you say, I feel like I'll have good people in my corner. So it's always it's good to have you. Yeah. And it's just been a joy to talk to you.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for having me on. I also feel enormously lucky that I got to work with you, that I get to call you friend, that I get to learn from you. So it's amazing to get to work with people like you in this movement. I feel just, like I said, enormously lucky.
Well, thank you, Steffen. And I say this also, like, you're always welcome on my program. If there's anything that you want to discuss or promote or anything, just invite yourself on and we'll do it again. But I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the future. So maybe we'll have you back on even sooner than later.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.